Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, we begin a new Masechta, a new Seder Kachim, which begins with Masechta Zevochim. So regarding Seder Kachim, it's a very special kind of a limud. The Gemara, when it speaks about the 6 different Zdarim of Shas, so it brings the pasuk V'hoyu Emunas Itecha, Chaysin Yeshuais, Chochmas V'das. Chochmas, word Chochmas, Gemara says, refers to Seder Kachim. Here's where you have the depth of the Chochmah of the Eibishter more than another Zdarim. That's what Chazal are telling you. There's a word that is brought from the Shem the Baal HaFlaw. He says that the Gemara says that when you learn Seder Nezikin, the halachas of Dinei Mominus, Hareitza Sheyachkim, if you want to be wise, you should learn Dinei Mominus. But on the other hand here, Chazal tell us that Chochmas is Dafke Seder Kachim. So the Afla said, Hareitza Sheyachkim, if you want to learn Seder Kachim properly, so learn first the Nezikin, about Dinei Mominus, and that will be the proper preparation to then learn the real Chochmah, which is in Seder Kachim. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, we finished Seder Nezikin, Mominus, and therefore we could have the right achana to learn Seder Kachim. Another interesting thing regarding Seder Kachim is there's a mimer, a very short mimer from the Alter Rebbe in Lakutei Torah, Parshas Kedoshim, V'hadarta Panei Zakin, where he speaks about the value of learning Torah and Torah Shebal Peh and Chazering it Bal Peh, to memory. That when you have Torah ingrained in you, in your memory, there's a big inyan. And the Alter Rebbe there at the end of the mimer specifically mentions Seder Kachim. He says that in Zman HaGolus, Mepnei Tzayke Itim, you have to Chazerois Mishnayos or Seder Bal Peh, it should be Seder Kachim. So the Rebbe spoke about this a number of times. That Dafke and Seder Kachim, there's a very big maila, that you have the inyan of the Karbonis. It's the time of Golus when you can't be marked of Karbonis, and we're lacking an inyan of Kapara the way it was B'Shleimus when you brought a carbon. So B'Zman HaGolus, when you learn about these inyanim of Kachim, Chazal tell us, it says probably somewhere in Masechta Zevochim or maybe Masechta Menachos, Kol ha'osek b'Torah ha'ila ki'ilu hikriv ha'ila, ha'osek b'Torah chatas ki'ilu hikriv chatas. So when you learn the Seder Kachim, besides it being the inyan of the Torah and all the inyanim that there are here, but it's also ki'ilu hikriv ha'ila. And that's inyan dafka now in this Zman HaGolus, where it's gaidim a bigger kayach of kapara and tshuva for the person when you learn this section in Shas. Okay, so the first Masechta of Seder Zevochim is Seder Kachim rather, is Masechta Zevochim, which is all the details of the Karbonis and the Beis HaMikdash, and also the things that invalidate the carbon, and the halachas of about all these steps of the Aveda, and who brings the carbon, and in order for him to be kosher, what he has to do to bring the carbon, all the halachas of Karbonis. The Masechta begins with the halach of the machshava of the carbon. What's the right thought that a person, the kayin, has to have when he brings the carbon? One of the ikr things of the carbon is the machshava of the person when you brought the carbon. The carbon means kiruv, to come close to Hashem, and the Ramban says when you bring a carbon, the main thing is the machshava of the person when he brings the carbon that brings the kapara. But here, we're talking about actually the machshava of the kayin. What's the right machshava of the kayin that does the aveda? That's the halachas that the Masechta opens with. Sagt der Heilige Mishnah, Kol Hazvachim, all of the Karbones, Shenizbechu, Shaloi Lishman, that they were shechted, but not for the sake of this carbon. So Rashi explains, what does this mean? You're bringing a carbon oila, and instead of thinking that you're doing it l'shem and oila, you bring it thinking that I'm doing the shchita, whatever part of the aveda you're doing is l'shem something else, l'shem shlomim. That's the simple pshat of the Mishnah. This is what's called shinui kodesh. You change your machshava in what level of kodesh, which carbon you're bringing it for. Taisvis adds that the Mishnah could also be including shaloi lishman, where you also changed the shaloi lishma of the bailam, the owner. You're bringing it for one person, and you're thinking, the kayin is thinking that he's bringing it for someone else. So the halacha is ksherim. The carbon itself remains a kosher carbon. And you could continue doing the Aveda. There's the other steps after the Shechita. You spray the blood, then you burn it on the Mizbeach, and you eat from it. So everything can be continued with this carbon. However, for the owner that brought this carbon, if he had an obligation to bring this carbon, whether it was a carbon chatos or he made a neder and he has to bring the carbon, so for his obligation, he's going to have to bring another carbon, So it takes away the fulfillment of his mitzvah, his chiyuv, by this kavan of shalei lishma, but the carbon itself is actually kosher. Chutz min ha-pesach v'achatas. There are two exceptions. The carbon pesach and the carbon chatas, that they become completely pasul. The Gemara will bring a pasuk for this. Now, ha-pesach, when we're saying here that the carbon pesach will be pasul with this kind of machshava, that's bismaneh. The carbon pesach that's brought in its right time on Erev Pesach, so then it has a status of a carbon pesach. A carbon pesach that's brought in any other time of the year does not have a status of a carbon pesach. Its halacha is like a carbon shlomim. And regarding carbon shlomim, we go back to the rule that even with this kavana, it'll still be kosher. V'hachatas b'chol zman. And the carbon chatas, any time of the year when the carbon chatas is brought, if you have this kavana shaloi lishma, it'll be pasul. It'll invalidate the actual carbon itself.
So what's pigul then?
We'll get the pigul. Everything is covered. This is not an union of pigul. We'll get to everything. It's everything here is in the Masechta. This is talking about a kavana that's a shinui kodesh, that he's thinking of another carbon, or, as I said, Taisus mentions shinui bailim. But pigul is a different concept. We'll see. Rabbi Eliezer says, for Asham, that it's not only these two, but there's a third that's also an exception, that this kavana shalei lishma makes it possible. The carbon Asham as well. And again, he says, ha-pesach bismanai, regarding the carbon pesach, if it's in its time on Erev Pesach, it will be possible with this kavana shalei lishma v'achatos v'ha'asham b'chol zman. Both the chatos and asham, any time of the year it's brought, will be possible with this kavana. Now, Rabbi Eliezer explains why he adds asham as well. Omer Rabbi Eliezer, ha-chatos ba'al chet. Carbon chatas is being brought for an aveda b'shegig, v'ha'asham ba'al chet. And a carbon asham is also brought for an aveda. So therefore we compare them. Ma chatas psula shalei lishma, just like the chatas will be pasul with this kavana shalei lishma. Afa asham psula pasul shalei lishma. So the same will be by the asham that it's pasul shalei lishma. Another opinion in the Mishnah that adds another halacha here. Yosi ben Chayni Omer hanishchatin l'shem Pesach, any of the karbanis. If you shechted it shalei lishma, but what was the kavana shalei lishma? He shechted, for example, a carbon shlomim, thinking that it's a carbon Pesach. Or l'shem chatos, thinking that it is a carbon chatos, psulin, those karbanis will be pasul. In other words, what Yesid ben Chayni is adding is, just like we're saying that Pesach and chatos are an exception, that when you bring them as a carbon, and you had a kavana shalei lishma when you brought them, that the carbon itself becomes invalidated. Similar regarding any other carbon. If your kavana was shaloi lishma, thinking that it's for a Pesach or a chatas, it will also completely invalidate the carbon. Shimon.
So he's the argument on the ratio that says shaloi lishma is ksheir.
Correct, but only going to be possible regarding these two karbanas. If you had the kavana shaloi lishma, l'shem Pesach and l'shem chatas, everything will be learned out in the Gemara. It's all from Sukkim. This is one of the unique things about, say, the Kachim, that we're not talking about Stam and Yonim that is based on Svaris, usually. I mean, the Gemara here right in the beginning actually will bring a Svara, but everything is learned from Sukkim. Shimon Achi Azariah says, so Rashi brings why he had this interesting name, Shimon, the brother of Azariah, because the Gemara in Saita says that he had a brother that supported him, and he made a deal with him that the Torah that he learns, he'll get the schus of the Torah that he learns because he supported him. So he said, Shchoton l'shem gevaya, when you shechted a carbon and you had the machshava shaloi lishma for a different carbon, but your kavana was l'shem gevaya mehen, for another carbon that's actually on a higher level of kedusha than the carbon that you're shechting now, ksheidin, then the carbon will be kosher. And the Gemara will actually discuss this. According to one opinion, or it's possible that ksheidin means that it'll be fully kosher, even for the bailim as well. He'll be yotzei chiyuv. Now, l'shem namuch me'en, if you bring the carbon and you're having a kavanah for a different carbon, and that different carbon is a lower level of kedusha than the one that you're bringing now, then psulin, then it will invalidate the carbon itself. And he explains what's the levels of kedusha. Keitzad, what does this mean? Kotche, kotchem, sheshachtan l'shem, kotchem kalem. If it's a carbon that's kotche, kotchem, which is on a higher level of kedusha, has to be shechted only on the tzafin of the mizbeach. You could only eat it for a day and a night, only in the azara. And you shechted it having in mind that this is kotchem kalem, which is a lower level of kedusha. You can shecht it anywhere in the azara. You can eat it in the Yerushalayim, and you can eat it for 2 days and a night. So psulin, because you shechted with a kavanah for a lower level of kedusha, it's possible. However, kachim kalim sheshachtel l'shem kachim kachim, if it's kachim kalim and you're shechting it with the kavanah that it is kachim kachim ksherim, then the carbon will be kosher. Another example, ha'bchoir va'maiser sheshachtel l'shem shlomim. The abchoir and the maiser behema, the 10th that has to be also shechted as a carbon, but you shechted it for the sake of a shlomim, and shlomim is considered to be a higher level of kedusha than the bchoir and maiser. So Rashi says because by shlomim you find more avedis than the bchoir and the maiser, even though they're both kachim kalim. But by shlomim, you have to put the blood in the mizbeach on all four corners. There's a different additional avedas that are done with it. Smichin, esachim, tnufas chazav v'sheik, as we'll see everything later in the Masechta. So since there's more avedas with it, it's a higher level of kedusha. So therefore, ksheir. However, shlomim, sheshachta, l'shem b'choir, or l'shem meiser, the shlomim that was shechted for the sake of thinking that this is a b'choir and a meiser, them psulin, because it's a lower level of kedusha, it'll be possible. Sagt the Gemara, Lama li lemisne, why is the Mishnah saying this lashon, Ela shaloi olu? The Mishnah said that you had this kavanah shaloi lishma, so the carbon is kosher. However, it will not work for the obligation that the owner had with this carbon. Why does it use this long term? Ela shaloi olu. Listni, why wouldn't the Mishnah say more bekitzer, v'lo olu lebailam l'shem chayva? It's kosher, but it did not work for the bailam for his obligation. What's the elo shaloi? Rashi says that even just one word like this, the Gemara is asking a question because it says la'olam yishan adam tamid derech kitzara. You have to use the shortest lashon possible. So this word elo is extra. And says the Gemara hakamash malon. What the Mishnah is teaching is lebailim hudolay alu l'shem chayva. For the owner, his obligation, he was not yetzer with this. Aval b'kedushasayu kaimi, the kedusha of the carbon itself is completely still there, and the aser l'shanuye b'hu. And it's not only that the carbon is still kosher, but now when you're going to continue bringing the carbon, it's aser for you to have any additional machshava shaloi l'shma. You may think to yourself, oh, I had a machshava shaloi l'shma, which did not invalidate the carbon. So maybe when I continue doing the aveda, if he has a wrong machshava, it doesn't matter anymore because he already had the wrong machshava and it didn't invalidate the carbon. So therefore, the Mishnah is saying no. For the owner, the carbon itself is completely kosher. Only for the owner, he doesn't bring his chiyuv, but the carbon itself is still a full kosher carbon. So when you're going to continue doing the aveda, make sure that you have the right machshava in the continuation of the aveda of this carbon, which is completely kosher. You're not allowed to have any machshava of shalei lishma.
But you changed it already from oil to shem shlom.
No, it doesn't change. That's the whole point there. It doesn't change the status of the carbon.
It stays
exactly. And you have to have. Yeah, and as here we'll see at the end of this inyan, Rashi will bring that the Gemara here says asur l'shanui b'hu, that the inyan of machshav shaloi l'shma is not only a question of whether it will invalidate the carbon or not. It's actually a isser. When you bring a carbon, you have to have the right machshav. It's asur to have a machshav shaloi l'shma. So what it's saying is, it's still that carbon oila, for example, and therefore it's asur in the continuation of your aveda to have any other machshav. So this is like Rava said. If in the beginning, the first aveda, you shechted it shalei lishma, asa lizlik dama shalei lishma, but then the next aveda and all the following avedas, you're not allowed to do the continuation of the aveda shalei lishma. What's the source for this? Maybe you would say that once you shechted it shalei lishma, then it doesn't matter the machshava afterwards. So you say,
which machshava is the kind doing? The guy's telling him. The Baal is bringing it for Shlamim.
For an Ayla. We're talking about an Ayla.
The Baal is bringing it for an Ayla. And he told him Shlamim.
Not told. This is all talking about the machshava of the Kohen. There's no told here. We're talking about the machshava of the Kohen himself.
Okay.
That's it. Actually interesting regarding the singing of the machshava here that we're talking about. So this is something that all the Mefarshim bring here, that Rashi in a few places and Tosfos say that it's really not just a machshava, it's bedibur. Only thing that will make that the bailam are not yetzer der chiyuv or by chatas and pesach, it's going to invalidate the carbon. It's not just a machshava. It's only if it was bedibur that he said that it's l'shem a different carbon. However, from the Rambam, it's mashma that it's just machshava. The machshava alone will invalidate the carbon. But it's all we're talking about the kohen himself. The kohen himself that's either thinking or saying this inyan that's shaloi l'shma. Now why?
He has to articulate it to somebody for them to know what he had in mind.
Lav dafke. If the kohen comes later and says he had this machshava, so that's, yeah. So the Gemara explains why the continuation of the carbon should you do it lishma. So svara. Either this is just based on logic, or we learned this from a pasuk. Svara, we could say that this is understood logically. Mishum deshani, svara is like the palace. Mishum deshani ba kol hani lishni. Again, mishum deshani ba kol hani lishni ba v'lezel. If he changed in his machshava regarding one avodah that he did, so for the rest of the avodas he should also change his machshava. Why should he change his machshava? The carbon in essence still remains a carbon oila. So and in be'etzem it's usher to have a different machshava. So if you were over on that issa regarding one of the avodas, the shchita, why should you change your machshava regarding anything else? Everything else you have to continue and have the right machshava when you do that avodah. Or Ibai say Mekra, or we could see this in the lashon of a pasuk. It says Moitzis Asecha Tishma. You should keep the words that come out of your mouth. Vasisa Kashena Darta. You should do like you said with as a vow. So it uses the lashon of Neder. Hashem Alekecha. And then the pasuk goes on to say Nidava. Now Nidava and a Neder are not the same thing. As the Gemara explains here, hi, Nidava, is this pasuk talking about a Nidava? Nederu. It started saying that it's a neder. Now, what's the difference between a neder and a nadav in relation to a carbon? The difference is that by a neder, it's when a person says harei alai. He takes the responsibility upon himself, and then even if this animal gets invalidated, like what the Mishnah is speaking about here, then he'll have to bring another carbon. Nadav is not that way. Nadav is harei zu. I'm going to bring this one, and if this one won't be able to be brought, then he doesn't have an obligation and no responsibility to bring anything else. So the question is, why does the pasuk use both terms, neder and nadava? Elos, what the pasuk is saying here is, Im kemoishen darta sisa yehei neder. If the way you made a vow that you're going to bring this, let's say for a shlomim, and it was brought for that, so then it'll be a neder. But v'loi nedav yehei. But if not, even if it wasn't brought the way you made the neder, it'll be a nedava. And so now that means that the carbon is not anymore a neder because you're not being yetzi yechiv with this anymore. Once there was a kavanah shalei lishma, but it's still a nedava. It's still a nedava as a carbon. And therefore, unedava mishari l'shanuyaba. Even if it's a nedava, but it still has the name of that carbon oila, are you allowed to change with it? Are you allowed to have a machshava of a different kind of a carbon? You're not. There's an issur, and here's where Rashi brings the source for this inyan, that the kavanah of shaloi l'shma, besides the point that it invalidates some of the carbonis, and it also causes that the bailim were not yetzer der chiyuv, there's actually an issur to bring a carbon, whatever it is, and have a kavanah shaloi l'shma. Rashi says that you learn it from the pasuk lo yechoshev. You should not think a different machshava of what the carbon is. And therefore, over here, the continuation of the avodah that he does has to be l'shma for what this carbon is meant to be. Amalei Ravina l'Rav Papa. Ravina says to Rav Papa. The Gemara starts here a new discussion regarding the kavanah of l'shma of our Mishnah. Rav Ravina says to Rav Papa, lehavis gabam ba'urta, you weren't with us last night. B'tchuma Becharmach, in the tchum of the city of Becharmach, the Rami. So this was Shabbos, Rashi says. So you couldn't be with us because before Shabbos came in, you couldn't come into the tchum in this place Becharmach. And now the Rami Rava Mili Ma'al Yiseh Ahadodi. Rava asked a very good question, a contradiction of two subjects, and Vishani Luhu, and he answered and he explained this. Now, my Mili Ma'al Yiseh, what was this? Very good idea that we learned from Rava, that he asked a question and explained. So it was here regarding this Mishnah. Tanan, the Mishnah here says, Kol Zevochim shenizbechu shalei l'shman chulu. When you have a carbon that was shechted shalei l'shma, so then what happens? The bailim, they're not yetzer now they're chiyov, or for the chatlas and the Pesach, it makes it, invalidates it. So now time the shalei l'shman. What I see from the Mishnah is the problem is only if it was shechted shalei l'shma. When you clearly had a kavanah not l'shma for a different carbon. However, if the person is just bringing the carbon stam, not a machshava l'shma for the carbon, and not a machshava shalei l'shma for a different carbon, so alu nami lebailim l'shem chayva. So even the owner will be yotze his obligation with bringing this carbon. So then it's completely valid. Meaning there's no din. The way some achrayim learned the pshat of here, what the Gemara is saying is there's no din actually that you have to have kavanah l'shma for a carbon. It doesn't require lishma. The shaloi lishma passes. That's we learn from the pasuk that it passes. But if you're having a kavanah stam, you bring the kavanah without thinking specifically which carbon it is, then it's going to be kosher. That's what we see here regarding a carbon. Alma again, alma stam nami kalishman dami. So we see from this that when you bring a carbon stam, it's the same like when you had a kavanah lishma, that it's going to be completely kosher even for the bailam as well. So here Rav asked the contradiction regarding a get where there's also over there's also a din about lishma and shaloi lishma that passes the get. What does it say in the Mishnah? Kol get shenichtav shaloi l'shem isha. A get that was written not for the sake of this woman the get is going to be used for. Puzzle. The get is going to be puzzle. Now, okay, so the Mishnah there is saying that it was written Shaloi Lishma, it was written Shaloi L'Shem Isha, and it's puzzle. But over there, the halacha is Ustame Nami puzzle. Even a get that was written just stam. You wrote a get for Reuven and for Leah, and without having in mind any specific person, and then there's two people, a man and a wife, that have this name, and you want to use it for them, it's going to be puzzle as well. It has to be written for a specific person, for a specific woman. So, how do we answer this contradiction? Why by a carbon do we say that when it's stameh, then it's going to be kosher, and by a get, if it's written stameh, then it's going to be puzzle? Vishani and Rava answered, Zevochim bistam l'shma moindim. By a carbon, the carbon is the stam is the status of it automatically is that it's here to be brought l'shma. And therefore, when you bring the carbon and you're thinking stam, it'll automatically be l'shem this carbon. Some say that the pshat is, and you see this maybe in Rashi as well, that it means that when the person is bringing the carbon, even just thinking stam, it's as if he thought beferish that it's going to be l'shma. However, Isha b'stame lav l'gerish noimedes. A woman, though, her status is not automatically here for the sake of divorce. She's married and not supposed to be divorced. And even if it's a case where a husband has to divorce his wife, but not dafke with this get, by a carbon you will makdish this behemoth for this carbon. So this is what this carbon is designated for, and now you're just bringing it. By the woman, you can't say that this get is designated for this woman, automatically already designated for this get. So therefore, you're going to have a kavanah of lishma in order for the get to be a kosher get. Now, so this is the question and answer that Rava explained, the difference between a get and a karbonis. But now the Gemara asks, where do you see though this concept? How do you know that this is taka true, this distinction between Zevochim, karbonis, and a get? Zevochim b'stameh kshedim minalan. From where do you know when it comes to the karbonis that if you bring the carbon stam, you're not having a kavanah shaloi lishma, but you're also not having a kavanah lishma. It's stam. It'll also be kosher minalan. What's the source for this? If you'll say, well, like the Gemara before was medai, you see it clearly from the lashon of our Mishnah, because what does it say? Only when the carbon is shechted, not lishma. Then I say that the bailam are not going to be yaitzu with this. V'loi katani, the Mishnah does not say shaloi nizbechu lishman. It wasn't shechted explicitly with the kavana of lishma, meaning that stam would be a problem. It does not say that. It says only when it's shechted explicitly shaloi lishma, then it's an issue. That's the diak of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, but if that's the case, gabe get nami, if so, it's the same by the get. Hakatani, the Mishnah there says the lashon, kol a get shenichtav shaloi l'shem isha pasal, a get that was written specifically not for this woman, it was written for someone else, then it's pasal. V'loi katani, the Mishnah does not say shaloi nichtav l'shem isha. It doesn't say there that the get was written not l'shem this isha, and then pasal. Then it would be pasal, meaning even if a get that was written stam, that it would also be possible. It doesn't say that there. So why are we making a difference in the diak from our Mishnah and from what we're learning out from the Mishnah of get? It uses the same expression. In both, it's saying that only when you explicitly had a kavanah shaloi lishma is it possible. So therefore, Ella, the Gemara says, from this lashon of the Mishnah here, you can't prove that stam would be kosher. So Ella, from where do we learn this out? Meha detnan. From this, that it says later in the Masechta, or from Miha, it says, Keitzad l'shman v'shaloi l'shman. What is an example where you bring a carbon where there was both a kavanah l'shma and a kavanah shaloi l'shma in this carbon that you brought? Okay, so the Mishnah says, l'shem Pesach. First he brought this carbon, having in mind for what the carbon is, which is a Pesach. It was a carbon Pesach, and he had the proper kavanah. Then afterwards, in one of the other avodas that he did, l'shem shlomim. He had kavanah that it was l'shem shlomim. Okay, so from what do we see here? When the Mishnah is describing what it means Shaloi Lishma, Keitzad, it's describing, it says the Shaloi Lishma is only if he thought L'Shem Shlomim. Then it's going to be a problem. So Time Edom L'Shem Pesach or L'Shem Shlomim. He brought it first L'Shem Pesach for what the carbon is, and then he's thinking L'Shem Shlomim, then it's issue. Ha L'Shem Pesach, L'Stameh, but if you would be first bringing it L'Shem Pesach, and then the other Aveda that he does afterwards, Ristam, not thinking specifically for any carbon. Kosher, then it would be kosher. So Alme, Stamon, Kilishman, Dami. So I see from here that Stam is considered to be like Lishma. The only thing that invalidates the carbon is if you have Beferish a Kavanah Shaloi Lishma. And as I mentioned before, some Achrayim say that really the point the Gemara is trying to say is there's no din by a carbon that requires Lishma. The Svar the Gemara brought before, Stomach Lishma. Stomach Lishma means because you were makdish it for this carbon, and then you bring it, so there really is no din b'chlal of kavanah lishma. The only thing that invalidates the carbon is if it's shaloi lishma, like the example here, a carbon pesach that's brought l'shem shlomim. That's the source. What says the Gemara? No, you can't learn out from that Mishnah either. Because Dilme Shani Hasam, I can tell you that maybe there it's different. The Amrinan, because there's a svara to say that Kala Oisal Das Rishayna Oisa. When you're bringing the same carbon and the first Aveda you did Lishma, even if in the continuations of the Aveda it was just Stameh, but I would say that it's continuing with the Kavanah that you started with in the beginning. So therefore the fact that you thought in the second Aveda, Stameh, it would be kosher, it doesn't prove that there's no necessity for Kavanah Lishma, but all it says is that you don't have to think it by every Aveda. Once you think it by the first, the continuation follows the first. But from where do you see that there is no din of Kavanah Lishma? So Ella says the Gemara Miseifa. Maybe we can prove from the next case that it says there in that Mishnah. There it says the opposite. That first he thought a kavanah shaloi lishman, and then lishman. Afterwards, in the next aveda was lishman. And the example would be l'shem shlomim. He's bringing a carbon pesach, and his first machshava was a shaloi lishma for a shlomim, and afterwards l'shem pesach. And so that's the example of shaloi lishma. So what does the Mishnah say is Shaloi Lishma? Time Adam L'Shem Shlamim L'Shem Pesach. The Shaloi Lishma is that it's a carbon Pesach and he's first thinking that it's L'Shem Shlamim. Hastame, but if his first Kavanah and the first Avedi does would be just Stam, and then the second one is L'Shem Pesach, kosher. So in such a case it would be kosher. So over here you see that even the first Aveda can't say that it's already following from what you thought in the beginning. The first Aveda, when is it called Shaloi Lishma? Only if he thinks Beferish L'Shem Shlamim, not Stam. But again, the Gemara says here there's also a svara to say that Dil Mishani Hasam. There, I can tell you the reason why only if he thought l'shem shlamim will it be a problem, because the Amrina we say Yechiach Seifi al Tchilasai. The way his kavana was in the end for l'shem Pesach, that really proves that if he had a kavana in the beginning stam, that the stam was really for the Pesach. He knew that it's a Pesach. V'haraya in the next aveda, he's thinking beferish for the Pesach. But that doesn't prove regarding a carbon where he only had a kavanah stameh that would be good enough. Maybe Yibemis do have to have a kavanah lishma. Or Inami, the Gemara says, even if you're not going to accept this svara of Yechiach Seifel Tchilasa, we don't say that it retroactively shows what his kavanah was in the beginning. But I could say, Aidi Detana Lishman and Shaloi Lishman, since it gives the example in the first case for Lishman and Shaloi Lishman, where the Shaloi Lishma is explicitly L'Shem, what's not this carbon, L'Shem Shlamim, Tananami Shaloi Lishman or Lishman. So it also gives a similar example when the first kavanah was Shaloi Lishma, that it was L'Shem Shlamim. But really, even if it was Stam, maybe it's also a problem. So there's no source from that Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Ella, the source for this idea here, that there's no din of Lishma by a carbon, but it's only the Shaloi Lishma that invalidates the carbon, that I is from here. The Mishnah says later in the Masechta, L'Shem Shishit Dvarim Azevach Nizbach. When you bring the carbon, there are 6 things, 6 points of the kavanah of what this carbon is brought for. L'shem zevach, has to be brought that you're shechting it for whatever it was sanctified for, carbon shlomim, whatever the carbon is. L'shem zeveach, you have to bring it also for the owner, that you're shechting it for him, that he should have a kapara for this. And l'shem, or l'shem Shem, that is, or the Bach here says l'shem Hashem, that you're bringing the carbon that it should be for the Eibishter. L'shem Ishim, you bring the carbon with the kavanah that it's going to be burnt on the mizbeach. You're not going to do anything else with it before you burn it on the mizbeach. And l'shem Reyach, and also that it should be brought as a Reyach on the mizbeach, and that Rashi says that excludes if you take the parts of the animal and you already roasted from before, and it's not going to have that reach then when you burn it on the mizbeach. And l'shem nichayach, and it should be a nachas ruach for the Eibishter that he said, and v'nasar etzaynai. And v'chatas v'asham, by the chatas and the asham has to be l'shem chet, since it's being brought as a kapara for an aveda, also has to be brought with a kavana that it should be a kapara for this chet. That's the 6 things or even 7 things. That is a kavana which is the lishma for every carbon. On Rabbi Yossi, and on this Rabbi Yossi says, Af mi shaloi hoye b'liboy l'shem achas mikol elu, even one that did not explicitly have the kavana for any of these 6 points, kosher. The carbon will still be kosher. Shetnai bezdenu, because this is a condition of the bezdin, that the person brings the carbon, the kayin brings the carbon stam, and it's going to mean that the carbon is being brought for all these kavanas, even if he didn't explicitly have it in mind. So what does this mean? The bezdin is a t'nai of the bezdin that the carbon will be automatically for these things. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? Now, asnu bezdin, would the bezdin make a condition, that the Gemara soon will explain here. But first, the Gemara is explaining what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Why did the bezdin make this t'nai that the kainim should not think the kavan of all these 6 points? Asnu bezdin, the bezdin made a condition, that the person, the kayin, should not say or think that the kavana is lishma, because dilme asilamema shalei lishmai, because he has to think all these details here, and he has to think the lishma, the proper lishma. He may then come to think the wrong thing for a wrong carbon. So many different karbanas that the kayanim are bringing, one after the other, and they have to have the right kavana. If he actually has to have the kavana of all these details, he may have the kavana for the wrong thing. So therefore, the bezdin made a takana that you should not have to have befeidish this kavana. It's when you bring it stam, it's going to be automatically a kosher carbon. Now, if you're going to say that when you bring a carbon and you have a kavana stam, you're not thinking explicitly for what the carbon is intended to be. So it's going to be possible. Kaimi bezdin or masni milsa the mefsilbei. Would bezdin come and institute to do something that would passel the carbon? Of course not. So from here you see that be'etzem there's no such a din of kavana lishma for the carbon, but the stam is good as well. The only problem is when you have a kavana shaloi lishma for the carbon, that invalidates the carbon. That's one mahalach that Achrayim learned regarding this inyan, that there's really no such a din of kavana lishma for a carbon. There is, however, other Achrayim that say that there is a din of lishma for a carbon. No, but I'm talking about the etzem inyan. That there is a din of lishma for the carbon. Elamai stome is lishma. When you bring the carbon of stome, that is the lishma of the carbon. Right? Again, this is a famous chikirib in the to the thing that Achrayim speak about. Either there's no such a thing lishma for a carbon. When the Gemara before said, once you amak this shit and this is what it's intended to be, that's a hezber to explain that there's taka no such a din of lishma. It's only the shaloi lishma that invalidates it. Or no, the be'emes is a din of lishma. Elamai, because you were makdish for this carbon, we say stoma is the lishma. That is taka the fulfillment of the lishma, and therefore only the shaloi lishma will invalidate it. So this is the maskana where the Gemara proves this point from. It's not an interesting thing. This last thing here that the Gemara says that Bezdin made this tonight that you shouldn't have to think all these kavanas because then the kaim may come to think the wrong machshava. The Rebbe used this Gemara also regarding miftzah tefillin. When you put on a tefillin for a yid that has no idea necessarily what the tefillin is, so someone asked the Rebbe that maybe you should have to tell him exactly what the tefillin is. He should know what's inside the tefillin and what the parshas are, and to know exactly what he's putting on, because then he said it might be a problem that maybe it's shaloi l'shma. The Rebbe B'chlal said that there's no issue of shaloi l'shma in this concept, but he wrote to the Rebbe, maybe there's no problem with this. It should be more of a hiddah that you should, before you put a person on film, he should know that it's not just blocks, but it's a box and it has parshas inside and exactly what's written on the parshas, which parshas they are. You should tell the person all the details. So the Rebbe brought this Gemara and says, look, you see even here by the Kainim that are doing that in the Beis HaMikdash, and it says Kainim Zerizanein, and the Bezdin is Masneh, that they shouldn't have to think all these kavanas, because then they may come to think a wrong machshava. You're going to start telling a person all the different details, he's hearing it for the first time, he may actually make a mistake in what you're saying, and now he may actually think that it has inside of the tefillin something which is not it, and then it might actually make more of a problem with his putting on tefillin. So therefore you tell a yid he's doing a mitzvah of tefillin, and that's enough. That's the right way to do the mitzvah with a yid.